Before a single brick was laid in the Bank of England, before the Dutch invented what Europeans call modern finance, before the word bond ever appeared in a Western ledger, there was Mali. There was Mansa Musa. There was a financial architecture so sophisticated, so deliberately organized, that it founded one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, and it did so 6 centuries before London figured out how to do the same thing. This is not a footnote. This is not a revision of history. This is history. The real kind. The kind that was buried, banned, mistranslated, and mislabeled, not because it was insignificant, but precisely because it was too significant to allow Black people to know about themselves. For the African diaspora today, this story carries weight that goes far beyond academic curiosity. It speaks directly to every Black entrepreneur who has been told that financial literacy is not part of their cultural inheritance. It speaks to every African student who sat in an economics class and heard Europe presented as the origin point of sophisticated commerce. It speaks to every community that has been denied loans, dismissed by institutions, and treated as though building generational wealth is somehow foreign to their bloodline. It is not foreign. It is ancestral. And reclaiming it begins with knowing what was always yours. The Mali Empire at its height was not simply large. It was staggeringly, incomprehensibly vast. By the early 14th century, it stretched from the Atlantic coast of present-day Senegal and Gambia, eastward across what is now Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and into the edges of Nigeria and Chad. It controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Arab world, and through those networks, to Persia, India, and the Mediterranean. Gold and salt were its primary commodities, and the empire's control over both made it the economic engine of the known world. Scholars estimate that at its peak, the Mali Empire may have controlled somewhere between half and 2/3 of the world's supply of gold. Let that sit for a moment. Half of the world's gold. Controlled by a Black African empire. Administered through institutions that were anything but primitive. The figure at the center of this story's most dramatic chapter is Mansa Musa I, who came to power around 1312 and ruled until approximately 1337. His name translates roughly to a king of kings, and the title was earned. His famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 remains one of the most extraordinary events in recorded human history. He traveled with a caravan estimated at 60,000 people, including 12,000 personal servants, soldiers, scholars, merchants, and heralds. He carried with him somewhere between 8 and 12 tons of gold, which he distributed so generously along his route through Cairo and across North Africa that he single-handedly triggered an inflationary crisis in Egypt that economists estimate took more than a decade to recover from. Arab chroniclers, who documented the event in real time, described Musa with awe and reverence. He was not described as a tribal chief. He was described as a sovereign. A ruler of immense sophistication and deliberate cultural power. But the financial story that often gets overlooked in the spectacle of that pilgrimage is what was happening back in Mali during and after Musa's reign. The empire maintained a centralized treasury. It employed a class of professional administrators, scholars trained at institutions like Sankore University in Timbuktu, who managed the flow of goods, taxation, and credit across thousands of miles of territory. Within this system, instruments that functioned as bonds and bills of credit were in active use. Merchants operating along trans-Saharan routes used written instruments called softaja, a form of credit note that allowed a trader in Timbuktu to transfer value to a trading partner in Tunis or Cairo without physically transporting gold across the desert. These were not informal arrangements. They were legally recognized, institutionally supported instruments of financial transfer. The infrastructure that made them possible, the scribes, the witnesses, the record-keeping, was housed in institutions that predate the Bank of England by more than 3 centuries. Now we must speak plainly about what happened to this knowledge. The colonial project was not only a project of territorial conquest. It was a project of intellectual conquest. To justify the enslavement of African people, To make the theft of an entire continent palatable to European populations and their governments, it was necessary to construct a story in which Africa had never produced anything worth preserving. This was not an accident of history. It was a policy. A deliberate, systematic, and violent erasure of the documented record of African achievement. When French colonial forces consolidated their control over the Western Sudan region in the late 19th century, the destruction of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage accelerated. Libraries that had been maintained for generations were seized, scattered, or destroyed. Manuscripts that documented the financial, legal, philosophical, and scientific knowledge of the Mali and Songhai empires were dismissed as religious texts of minor importance, if they were acknowledged at all. European historians writing in the 19th and early 20th centuries actively denied that sub-Saharan Africans were capable of the kind of institutional complexity that the evidence clearly documented. Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian who wrote about Mali in the 14th century, described its administrative systems in detail. His accounts were available to European scholars. They were simply ignored or reframed in ways that minimized African agency. The transatlantic slave trade added another layer to this erasure. When millions of Africans were forcibly removed from the continent and transported to the Americas and the Caribbean, they were stripped of their names, their languages, their religious practices, and their professional identities. Blacksmiths, weavers, merchants, scholars, healers, people who carried living traditions of technical and intellectual knowledge, were reduced to the category of property. The deliberate destruction of their cultural memory was not a side effect of enslavement. It was one of its core mechanisms. A people who know their history cannot be convinced that they have none. European financial historians writing about the development of modern banking consistently trace the story through Italy, through Holland, through England. The Medici Bank, the Dutch East India Company, the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, these are presented as the beginning of sophisticated finance. The Islamic financial world, which had developed many of the instruments that Europe later adopted through contact during the Crusades and through trade with the Arab world, is occasionally acknowledged in footnotes. The African institutional context that fed into and paralleled these developments is almost never mentioned at all. And yet it survived. Against deliberate suppression, against colonial violence, against centuries of enforced forgetting, the evidence survived. The most dramatic proof of this survival came through a project that began quietly and then astonished the world. In the 1980s and 1990s, scholars began to systematically locate and catalogue the manuscripts that had been hidden in private family collections across the Sahara and the Sahel. In Timbuktu alone, researchers eventually identified and began preserving more than 700,000 manuscripts. 700,000. These documents covered astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, theology, philosophy, and economics. They included detailed records of trade transactions, legal contracts, letters of credit, and administrative correspondence that documented the financial sophistication of the Mali and Songhai empires in granular, specific, irrefutable detail. The Mama Haidara Commemorative Library and the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu became centers of this preservation effort. Scholars from Mali, from Senegal, from universities across the African continent and the diaspora began the painstaking work of transcribing, translating, and analyzing documents that had been waiting for centuries to be read by the wider world. What they found was not primitive record-keeping. What they found was a legal and financial literature of stunning complexity, documents that describe the mechanics of contracts, the obligations of debt instruments, the rights of creditors and debtors, and the role of institutional arbiters in resolving commercial disputes. The language was